Surge XT is a powerful, free, and open-source hybrid synthesizer. We're going to start learning this synth by looking at all the different oscillators that the synth supports. Now, before we jump into the oscillator types, let's go over the basics. Surge gives you 3 oscillators that you can work with, not including the noise oscillator. You've got some standard controls, such as key tracking, retriggering, and octave shifts, as well as a pitch slider. I'm going to assume you know what these do. Surge also has 2 scenes to work with. If you combine both the scenes together by switching to the dual scene mode, you now have 6 oscillators to work with, 3 from scene A and 3 from scene B. You can set the levels of each scene's 3 oscillators here. You can also do digital ring modulation and blend it in for adding some subtle or not so subtle aggression to your sounds. You can also add in noise and adjust the combined gain of the scene's oscillators. Each oscillator can be muted or soloed. The boxes above the gain sliders are for filter routing. Send the signal to filter 1, filter 2, or to both. This will be discussed more in another video. Finally, we can do some limited FM modulation using the oscillator FM routing panel. If at any point you want to learn more about a setting, just click the Help option and it will bring up the description in the manual. Surge has very good documentation. Now, we're ready to look at the oscillator types. Let's start with the modern oscillator. This will look like the digital waveforms you may be used to seeing. The sawtooth, square, and triangle options use the same set of sliders, but with the waveform sliders repositioned. The sine waveform uses the same settings, but instead of a triangle slider, it has been replaced by sine. Another thing to note is that the oscillator produces a lot of harmonics. This isn't a bad thing, it just gives you a little more of an analog sound. You can adjust the waveform parameters to mix the waveform types. The width parameter is used to widen or narrow the pulse waveform. The sync parameter does a hard sync on the waveform, increasing its frequency, changing its timbre, while distorting it somewhat. And of course, it has unison settings for the number of voices and unison detune amount. An interesting use of unison is to extend the detune amount to an octave. Right-click on the unison detune and select Extend Range and max it out to 1200 cents or 1 octave. It will then spread the number of voices across plus or minus 1 octave, which can lead to some interesting harmonies and dissonance. The classic oscillator is a nice virtual analog oscillator. The sawtooth and square waveforms look and sound more analog. You can blend between sawtooth and square by sliding the shape slider. The width parameter changes the pulse width of the waveforms as you'd expect. Submix is used to blend in a sub-oscillator, which is a pulse wave 1 octave below the main pitch. Slide it all the way to the left and you have no sub-oscillator, and all the way to the right, or 100%, only has the sub-oscillator. Anywhere in between is a mix of the two. The sub-oscillator is also affected by the width controls. The sync and unison settings are the same as what we've already seen. I'd like to also point out that you can put in some oscillator drift for a more analog sound. The oscillator drift works on all the different oscillators and produces a different random wobble for every oscillator in unison voice. Here's what it sounds like on a single voice, and here's multiple voices. Wavetable is your standard wavetable oscillator. It has tons of wavetables to choose from, including a bunch made by your favorite sound designers. Unfortunately, you can't edit wavetables in Surge, but you can import wavetables made by other tools, and you can also export the wavetables. The morph knob is used to change the wavetable position, while the skew, saturate, and formant parameters are used to shape the waveform. Another thing to note is that Wavetable uses a non-smoothed approach to sampling that makes it sound more like 1980s era hardware, and this produces an effect called harmonic aliasing. What this means is that with a Wavetable oscillator, you get some extra harmonics that sound musical, but it can sometimes sound a little harsh for smooth waveforms, so if it's a problem, you might want to filter it out. Here's what the frequency spectrum of a sine wave looks like. You can see the extra harmonics in here, including some extra high-frequency sound. Some of the wavetables are labeled HQ, which stands for high quality. You'll notice they're smoother and higher quality, as they have a longer frame length, and I've seen that this sometimes cleans up some of the harmonic distortion a little. The window oscillator is a wavetable oscillator, but it's implemented a little differently. The key difference is that the wavetable is multiplied by one of 9 window functions, which further shapes the waveform. Play around with these and see how it changes your sound. Of course, the morph knob is still used to change the wavetable position. The formant slider acts somewhat like a sync control and drastically changes the timbre of the sound. If you want to see what the window looks like, turn the formant slider all the way up and see how it shapes the waveform. Several of the oscillators have an optional high-pass and low-pass filter. To use them, right-click on either high-cut or low-cut and select Enable. This is useful because it lets you shape your sound per oscillator and lets you save your main filters for other uses. You also have the standard unison options. Another difference between the wavetable and window oscillators is that window uses more traditional resampling when making the sound, so it doesn't have this harmonic aliasing. Here's what its frequency spectrum looks like compared to wavetable spectrum. The sine oscillator makes a sine wave, among other waveforms, and has an FM feedback option where the waveform is fed back to modulate itself. Note that the range of the FM feedback slider is extended by default for a more extreme and noisy effect. This oscillator gives you the cleanest sine wave. Here's how a sine wave using a sine oscillator compares to a sine wave in the modern oscillator. Surge has 2 simple, dedicated FM oscillators. The first one, FM2, is more musical because the 2 modulators are always at integer multiples of the carrier. You can set the modulation amount and ratio for each modulator. The M1/2 offset slider is used to detune the modulators, and the phase control changes the initial phase of the modulators. Feedback makes the carrier modulate itself. FM3, on the other hand, is more extreme. It has 3 modulators on the carrier. Each modulator has a bigger frequency range and allows for non-integer multiples, which produces harsher, less musical sounds. It also has a carrier feedback option. You can also set it to absolute mode, where you can set the frequency directly rather than the ratio. String is a physical modeling oscillator used to simulate string sounds. There are 2 ways to stimulate the string model, either with a burst or with a constant stimulation. Use the burst mode for pluck sounds, and the constant mode for bowed sounds, and other creative uses. The exciter option selects the waveform used to stimulate the string model in either burst or constant mode. Think of it as representing what you use to pluck the string or how you bow the string. You can also set the exciter level for harsher or softer sounds. This oscillator has 2 string models running in parallel. You can set the decay of each string independently and detune them relative to each other. You can also alter the balance between the 2 strings. All the way to the left uses string 1 only. All the way to the right uses string 2 only. And anywhere in between blends the 2 together. The stiffness slider adds either high-pass or low-pass filtering to the string's feedback loop, and this can really change the timbre of the sound. The exciter also has an option for an audio input. Each DAW is different, but in Ableton Live 10.1 or above, you can send audio into surge through the sidechain input as shown here. Now, suppose you wanted a snare hit to be the exciter for your string. Take the snare track into Surge's sidechain input in Ableton, set the string oscillator's exciter to audio in, and adjust the settings. It doesn't have to be audio clips either. You can send the audio output of a synth into Surge as well. The constant sweep exciter is probably my favorite. Here's a nice bass sound you can make from it. From the default settings, set string 2 detune to 0 cents, set the string balance all the way to the right to use only string 2, add a low pass filter on it, and set the octave a little bit lower. Also set the play mode to mono. Twist is a multi-purpose oscillator based on a popular Eurorack module. There's too much to cover here, so play around with it and see what sounds you can make. The LPG, or low-pass gate, can be enabled through the right-click menu. An LPG is basically a filter and an envelope that turns your sound into short, plucky bursts. Play with the response and decay values to get the sound you want. For the Alias oscillator, the Surge manual says it best. The Alias operator purposefully ignores a few decades of research into making digital sounds with low or no aliasing, and does all the things you shouldn't do, so it purposefully sounds digital, gross, broken, terrible, yet awesome all at once. You can select the waveform using the shape drop-down box. You have familiar waveforms such as sine, ramp, pulse, and noise, but you have a few different ones such as an additive waveform that you can edit, audio input, a set of waveforms under the quadrant shaping option, and some random options in the memory from set. The additive waveform gives you a basic additive synthesis option. Once selected, an Edit button appears, where you can set the amplitude of 16 harmonics. Now it's not as nice as Serum or Vital's Wavetable editor, but it's nice to have the option when shaping your sound. You can right-click in the editor and select some basic waveform shapes, or do a few basic operations. This oscillator gives you the dirtiest sound. Here's a sine wave in Alias. For comparison, here's a sine wave in the modern oscillator, the window oscillator, and the sine oscillator. You have a few options to digitally distort the sound. The ramp slider acts a lot like a hard sync. The mask slider applies an 8-bit mask to the sound, which digitally distorts it. Threshold does a few things depending on the shape. For the pulse shape, it adjusts the duty cycle or width of the waveform. For the ramp waveform, it moves the sawtooth shape around. And for the others, it adjusts where the waveform is read from memory, which acts a lot like a phase shift, but where it doesn't reset nicely, which adds some high frequencies to the sound. Finally, you have a bit crush setting. You also have your standard unison settings. The sample and hold noise oscillator gives you a crunchy, bass-heavy digital noise. One way to think of it is it's like a square wave, but rather than stepping between two values, high and low, it steps to any number of values in between. Here's what it looks like in a frequency analyzer. The sample and hold noise's correlation setting lets you set the randomness of the noise. All the way to the right has no randomness, and you get an analog-style square wave. As you slide it to the left, it becomes more random and degrades the tone in a cool way. Try adding a little bit of degradation to the sound and see what you think. The width slider sets the duty cycle to waveform, which is the percentage of time that the waveform is either high or low. So basically, the width. The low cut, high cut, sync, and unison settings you've all seen before. Play around with the unison settings to get a wider, noisier sound. You can also use audio input in place of one of your oscillators. As mentioned earlier in the video, in Ableton Live 10.1 and above, just select the audio track in the Ableton device's sidechain input. You can look up this article to learn how to do this in your DAW. You can also route the audio from Scene A into Scene B. One use of this is to do some parallel processing on Scene A's sound and add different filters, effects, or modulations to it. And finally, let's not forget we have the standard white noise generator. You can change the color of the noise using this slider here. The low frequencies are emphasized in the left position, and the high frequencies are emphasized in the right position. And the middle gives you standard white noise. If there's a feature of Surge, or if there's another synth you're interested in, let me know about it in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.